Hey, it's Dr. Brad and the latest in space news, and we have to start with this beautiful video and time-lapse taken from Juno around Jupiter. Now, Juno is a dedicated mission, in fact, the first dedicated mission to orbit Jupiter. And as we see in this time-lapse, the spacecraft gets closer, skimming the atmosphere and then flying away. And Juno has to do this really interesting orbit because Jupiter actually emits lots of radiation. And if the spacecraft were to fly through it, it would be bombarded and destroyed. So it does this really egg-shaped elongated orbits coming in, zooming really close by and flying out. And Juno is tasked to study Jupiter in detail. It's looked at what's the inside of Jupiter, trying to figure out how deep the clouds are. Why does Jupiter have a big red spot? Why are the storms like they are? Everything and anything we've ever wanted to know about Jupiter, Juno's been dedicated to do it. And this time-lapse has taken over the 40th flyby, this 40th weird orbit of Juno around Jupiter. And some apparent UFO activity over Broome, but not. This video was taken from Western Australia in the area relatively of Broome. And these mysterious lights, you can see why they caught people's eyes. But what it wasn't a natural sort of phenomenon. It wasn't aliens. It was a rocket. This was a China Long March 3 rocket re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, disintegrating and breaking up. Now, this actually does happen more often than people think, usually over more remote locations or the ocean. In this case, this rocket launched about last year and has kind of been sitting in orbit since then, re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, breaking up and creating this very interesting disintegration over the skies of Western Australia. And some exciting results from the planets Uranus and Neptune and why they look different. Now, Uranus and Neptune are what we call ice giants. They're very different planets, say, than Saturn and Jupiter. And ice giants, we think, are quite common in exoplanet systems, planets around other stars. And when studies and calculations have been done about Uranus and Neptune, their sizes and masses and atmospheres and all sorts of stuff, it always says, hey, they're very similar, but the question is, why do they look different? Clearly, Uranus and Neptune look different. And some new data from the Hubble Space Telescope and Gemini Observatory say, yeah, they are the same, but the reason Uranus is a tad different is due to haze. So what they say is if you add kind of a bit of haze to that darker, rich blue of Neptune, you can kind of see and get this lighter bluey color of Uranus. So in fact, confirming that yes, Neptune and Uranus are the same, but because of haze in the atmosphere of Uranus, this is why it looks different. So this is super exciting to help us understand and get insights into these bigger, slightly mysterious planets in our solar system. And lots of activity both around the space station and getting to the moon. Russia has just launched the fastest cargo supply mission to the International Space Station. So no humans, but fuel, food, and other supplies. And it only took them about 3 hours. So you kind of have to play catch up with the International Space Station. And they only had to do essentially 2 orbits. Every orbit takes about 90 minutes to reach the International Space Station and dock. So getting a lot better and a lot more efficient at doing this. And speaking of which, NASA has awarded SpaceX 5 more contracts to send more crews of astronauts up. So SpaceX Crew 4 is already on the International Space Station. There's already 4 more planned, taking it through Crew 8. But NASA says, hey, we want longevity, we want a plan going into the future. They awarded an extra 5 on top of that for future missions of astronauts, mostly American astronauts, but usually they have other countries as well going to the International Space Station. So this view of SpaceX serving as space Uber for NASA, they're really taking advantage of it and having all these missions. But NASA's also focused on the moon. And so they're going to be testing for the second time their new big moon rocket called the Space Launch Systems. Now, this is what we call a wet rehearsal where they roll it out to the rocket pad, they fill up the fuel, they make sure everything works, and they do everything except take off. They did try this last month, but they found a few problems, so they're hoping second time's a charm, it all works. And if it does, we're looking at a launch to the moon for this rocket for the first time in a month or 2. Now, getting to the moon is not just about sending rockets, but also people. And in fact, one of the big critical things is new spacesuits. Spacesuits are going to have to be specially designed to custom fit the astronauts, as well as work on the conditions of the moon. Operating on the moon is different than the International Space Station, so it requires a new type of spacesuit. And in the past, they've actually kind of been generic sizes, small, medium, and large, believe it or not. This has actually created problems. So what they want is kind of customizable parts so you can get more tailored spacesuits to the astronaut, which will help both in their maneuvering, but also limit potential health and physical problems operating these spacesuits. And when the astronauts get there, they may be staying in a space station, and this is something NASA will be testing over the next week. The Gateway, as it will be called, will be the first moon space station. Yes, in a few years' time, there will be a space station around the moon. In order to pull this off, though, it has to be in a very special orbit, because when you go around the far side of the moon, sometimes called the dark side, but not dark, you lose contact with Earth. And this is critical. If you're on the far side of the moon and try and talk to Earth and something goes wrong, you can't communicate with it. So this CubeSat called Capstone will be launched and have this very weird kind of zigzagging up and down orbit going around the moon, but making sure essentially it could always be in line of sight and contacting the Earth, so that even when it's in that far side shadowy part of the moon, they can still talk to Earth in case they need to and for safety. So lots happening in space, from beautiful photos of Jupiter to new orbits around the moon and everything in between. I hope you liked this video. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube to keep up to date for more space news.